Welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 158. And this time we're going to talk about Archie Shepp's album on Impulse from 1965, 4 for Trane. And what I have here is a reissue from sometime in the later 60s with, of course, the lovely glossy Impulse outer sleeve and the fantastic and extensively verbose inner gatefold. This is the first high-profile release for Archie Shepp, that great proselytizer of free jazz, the new thing, avant-garde, call it what you will. It's an album the content of which was required by the record label to be more accessible than the kinds of things that Shepp was playing in the clubs at the time. Of the 5 tracks, 4 of them are relatively well-known pieces by John Coltrane. There's only one genuinely avant-garde track on here, the 5th track. This all might seem kind of controlling and conservative, and in its intent, it actually kind of was. But it turns out it's a bit of a masterstroke to bring Archie Shepp and his co-conspirator, John Chikai, into a more confined setting, because these familiar songs are twisted into new configurations, and the energy of these players just explodes through the needle and out of your speakers. Archie Shepp was born in Fort Lauderdale, but like so many great jazz players, he was actually raised in Philadelphia. Growing up, he learned piano, clarinet, and alto sax, but by his teens, he'd switched to the tenor sax. Moving into the New York jazz scene, his first big break was getting a gig with Cecil Taylor, and he appears in a number of Taylor's excellent early albums, including The World of Cecil Taylor and Air. His own quartet with Bill Dixon, the Archie Shepp-Bill Dixon Quartet, debuted under their own name as leaders for the first time in Savoy Records in 1962. Shepp, like so many other young players around this time, had been heavily influenced by Ornette Coleman's work, and around this time, along with Chikai, who was an alto saxophonist, and Don Cherry, who was a trumpeter, he joined the New York Contemporary Five. It didn't take too long for Shepp and John Coltrane to come into each other's orbits, and as it turns out, it's actually John Coltrane who's instrumental in getting this record made. Shepp had wanted to be on Impulse Records and record on Impulse for quite some time, and certainly since Coltrane had moved over. He'd been phoning the record label every day pretty much, using up all his spare quarters and trying specifically to get hold of Bob Thiel, who was a producer who produced Coltrane, lots of other folks. Thiel was resolutely not calling it back. Probably because Thiel was of the opinion that while it might be hip and trendy in New York, the avant-garde stuff at this stage was not going to ship a lot of records outside. Of course, Coltrane had been doing wilder and wilder stuff for Impulse at the time and had been taking a fair amount of critical heat for it. But he was a name. He stuck his name on a record and it was pretty much a guaranteed seller. Anyway, in that summer of 1964, Shepp is getting pretty frustrated. One night, he's sitting in with Coltrane's quartet at the half note, and he reaches out to John and says, "Look, can you help me? I've been trying to get a hold of Thiel, can't get a call back, what's going on?" Coltrane was a little bit hesitant at first because lots of people were constantly trying to use him to get exactly this kind of thing. But Shepp was not just anybody. Coltrane really believed in him, played with him, and really did want to see him succeed. So Coltrane agrees to reach out to Thiel. The very next day, Shepp called Impulse like he did pretty much every day. But this time, the receptionist said, "Mr. Thiel's not in right now, but he's expecting your call and he'd love to talk to you at 3 p.m. And so the connection was made. When they did sit down and talk, Thiel said, "I'm willing to do this, but I got to tell you, you can't play the avant-garde stuff because that's not going to sell. Here's a set list you got to do." And he basically said, "You got to do Coltrane covers." Shepp had no problem with that. He was a huge fan of Coltrane. This was a big opportunity, and he was not going to let it pass him by. And he was right not to, because this really was his big break. He was signed to a multi-record deal with Impulse, and he released a string of burners for them, including The Way Ahead, Fire Music, Mama Too Tight, and The Magic of Juju, all absolute classic records. And while those albums for Impulse in the 60s were the making of Shepp, he went on to have a truly diverse and brilliant career, a whole bunch of different records. He alternated between soul jazz and free jazz largely. Moreover, he was a real force to be reckoned with in the artistic and intellectual flourishing of Black America in the late 60s and the early 1970s, a real giant. Bob Thiel, of course, is on this record as a producer, but so is John Coltrane, which is a little unusual. The engineer, of course, is the incomparable Rudy Van Gelder, and this is, of course, recorded in Van Gelder's incomparable studio in Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey, where so many great Impulse and Blue Note and other records were recorded in the 60s. Although Coltrane's on the cover, and more on that in a second, he doesn't actually play on this record. The lineup is Shepp on tenor sax, Chikai on alto sax, Roswell Rudd on trombone, and Rudd also, with Shepp, did a lot of the arrangements of the songs. On bass is a brilliant Reggie Workman, who makes a major contribution to this record. The drums are handled by Charles Moffett, and there's one more horn in this record, which is a flugelhorn, and that's played by Alan Shorter, who, of course, is Wayne Shorter's brother. In preparation for the record, Shepp and Rudd rearranged 4 well-known Coltrane pieces, and prior to coming to the studio, practiced these in the clubs night after night. 3 of these are from Giant Steps, Saida's Song Flute, Cousin Mary, and Naima, and there's one from Coltrane Plays the Blues, Mr. Sims. Even as they arrived out at Van Gelder's that day, Thiel was still kind of skeptical. He was still feeling as if he'd been manipulated to the session. He wasn't really sure what he was going to get. And to hear Shepp tell the story, he was still pretty standoffish in the early parts of the date. But as it progressed, he was pleasantly surprised. The music was absolutely fantastic. And so he calls up Coltrane and says, "Look, John, you got to come out and hear these guys." Of course, Coltrane knew they were good. He'd recommended them in the first place. But being a good guy, he pulls on a coat, gets in his car, and he drives from his place in Long Island all the way out to New Jersey to hear the rest of the date. And this photograph is actually taken after he's arrived. And as Shepp points out, Coltrane is not actually wearing socks because he's probably just gotten off his couch after he got the call from Thiel. And I always think that Coltrane looks like you or I might look if it were the middle of the night and we've been called out to drive across town and go to a photo shoot without socks on. And I also love the way Shepp looks as if he's basically got this nailed at this point. Of the 5 tracks in this record, the first 4 are the Coltrane ones, and the very first of those in side 1 is Saida's Song Flute. Like all the Coltrane tunes in this record, which were originally recorded with quartets, these versions benefit for having the richer palette of a sextet. The head arrangement is quite interesting, but then when Shepp comes in, it's like wham. Let there be no doubt that this might be a tribute album of sorts, but there is no mimicry here. It's also very much a group performance, with the horn players punctuating the track with all kinds of vibrant lines. In particular, and as amazing as Shepp's playing is here, the other real standout is Roswell Rudd's trombone, which is kind of like a drunk in a bar all the way through the track, in a good way. Towards the end of the track is a big stretch out for the rhythm section, which includes an excellent solo for Workman way down on the neck of his bass, very high notes. The next track, Mr. Sims, offers a really distinct arrangement of the head compared to the original version. Much more drama, much more enthusiasm. Of note here is Alan Shorter's extended solo, which is, I think, a bit of a nod to Coltrane because he seems to, very much as Coltrane would do in his recording sessions, tackle the same figure again and again, coming at it from different angles and different attempts, almost experimenting while recording. Side 2 starts with Cousin Mary, which feels like a sped up, more rhythmic version than the original, and that has a lot to do with Workman's walking, or actually running bass line, which absolutely propels the track forward. On this track, you can really hear the influence on Shepp of Coltrane, but also of Coleman. But it's also true that here and elsewhere, Shepp is much more in touch with soul and blues, I think, in his playing than either of those players, actually, particularly Coltrane. Maybe it was due to the influence of those 2 periods with Miles, but Coltrane, despite the titles of some of his songs and his albums, had typically charted the path away from the blues and much more towards the new thing. Shepp, of course, was a new thing artist, but his career is constantly interwoven and constantly goes back to touch soul music and to touch the blues in ways which Coltrane's never did. There's great work here by Alan Shorter and some brilliant work by John Chikai, who absolutely pulls off that thing of doing an avant-garde solo within a song which is still swinging pretty hard in conventional jazz structures. The last Coltrane song in the record, the one which has had the most surgery done on it by Shepp and Rudd, is Naima, which of course is a song which Coltrane had written for his wife at the time. The opening bars are kind of this mind-blowing blend of the original melody plus the theme to Star Trek, if that makes any sense. It evolves into a very sultry performance. This kind of reminds me a little bit of the more Tennessee Williams-y kind of sounding parts of Mingus's Black Saint and the Sinner Lady, particularly with all the bent notes that Shepp's using. The last song is the only Shepp original, and it's called Rufus Swung His Face at Last to the Wind, then his neck snapped, an obvious lynching reference, and not too surprising coming from Shepp, who was, as I mentioned, a very political artist and a very socially conscious artist as well as a brilliant musician. This is, well, not the most out there stuff you're ever going to hear, properly avant-garde stuff, the kind of stuff that Thiel didn't want comprising the entire record. Chikai makes another brilliant contribution here, but I'm actually obsessed listening to this track again and again, not by that brilliant solo, but by the underlying work of Workman and Moffat, which is just incredible. Shepp remains on fire. He's basically a force of nature all the way through this record. And then a lovely solo by Workman. I mean, this guy, he was the backbone of so much great music of the 20th century, and I think needs to be acknowledged as such. There are a number of things that stick with me from this record. First of all, Shepp is absolutely unintimidated by the prospect of reworking the master's compositions right in front of him in the studio. Just look at him on the front cover there. The second is the sheer quality of the arrangements done by Shepp and Rudd and the emotional exuberance of the playing. The final thing is that I find it amazing how, despite the fact that Thiel had laid down some pretty conservative structures for this particular record, the attitude of these players of the new thing totally shines through regardless. And they do so in a way which doesn't make the old version seem stodgy, doesn't kind of show Coltrane up. It just shows how much is possible to reimagine within a structure which is already set. So this record is an example of that relatively rare thing, a thoroughly original album of covers. I'd call this an essential part of any jazz collection, 60s or otherwise, and it's 5 out of 5.